It all started during my sophomore year of high school. I was part of the cast and costume crew for our fall play. Among the group was a guy named Max. He was the type who always wore skinny jeans, and honestly, he was really cute. I learned from a mutual friend that he was bisexual, and that was all the encouragement I needed to start flirting with him. I'd find excuses to hang out with him, send him funny memes, and generally do everything a closeted nerd like me could think of. After about 3 months of this, I finally worked up the nerve to ask him out on the last day of the play. To my relief, he said yes. There was a problem, though. My mom was a very conservative Christian, and while she wasn't openly hostile to gay people, I knew she'd never let me have a boyfriend while I still lived under her roof. So, I kept our relationship a secret, which wasn't too hard in the beginning. We'd go to the movies or hang out at his place. Nothing too complicated. But things started to go wrong after the first time we had intercourse. Max began to get really demanding about spending time together, and by demanding, I mean he was never not frustrated if we weren't constantly hanging out. At first I didn't mind. It was new and exciting. But it wasn't long before it started to wear on me. Balancing a secret relationship with my mom's rules was exhausting, and my natural tendency to be a bit of a loner wasn't helping. I tried talking to Max about it, and he seemed to get it for about a week. Then he started acting out, avoiding me at school, sending me nasty texts, and getting ridiculously jealous of my friends. By July, I was done. I ended things over text while I was on vacation in Florida. I know, not the most mature move, but I was only 16. Max didn't take it well. He blew up my phone for days, alternating between angry and desperate. After a week, he seemed to calm down and started acting like we were friends again. When school started back up, we found ourselves in 4 out of 7 classes together, thanks to our earlier attempts at coordinating our schedules while we were dating. At first, everything seemed okay, but then he started staring at me in class. He'd send me sad, cryptic messages, and before long, he was trying to worm his way back into my life. He'd show up whenever I was with my friends, begging me to take him back. I kept saying no, explaining that it wasn't going to work. By October, things took a darker turn. Max started sending me messages in the middle of the night about how he was thinking of swallowing a whole bottle of melatonin. Looking back, I should have gone to someone for help, but I was terrified of my mom finding out, so I tried to handle it on my own, which was a huge mistake. Max only got worse. He started threatening to kill himself regularly and tried to turn my friends against me. The worst moment came during our drama club's homecoming float preparation. I was chatting with 2 of my guy friends, Isaac and Caleb, who were both straight. Max saw us, stood up, and walked out without a word. A little while later, a freshman girl came up to me, asking where Max had gone because he said I'd know. It turned out he had driven himself to the ER to get counseling. I thought maybe this would help him, but I had no idea how obsessed he'd become. One day, I came home from rehearsal to find his car parked up the street from my house. Max was walking away from my porch, where my mom was standing, waving goodbye to him. She thought we were just friends and really liked him. He told her he'd been in the neighborhood and decided to drop by. For some context, I'm the oldest of 7 boys. At the time, my youngest brothers were 2 years old and the other was still on the way. My mom, who was mostly raising us on her own, is a 6-foot-tall, no-nonsense woman who can handle herself, and she's the best shot with a pistol I've ever seen. Max, on the other hand, was barely 5'4" and weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. Definitely not someone who should have been messing with her. I told her that Max and I hung out sometimes, just not as much as he made it seem. She accepted this explanation, and for a week everything seemed fine. Then, I came home from rehearsal one day and saw Max's car parked up the street again. This time, he was sitting on our porch with my mom, who had my baby brother on her lap. When she saw me, she motioned for me to come over. That's when she told me Max had revealed everything to her, our entire relationship. But he'd twisted the story, painting me as the abuser and himself as the victim. My mom was furious and gave me an earful before sending Max off with a satisfied smirk on his face. After she finished, I calmly explained my side of the story. Thankfully, she believed me. but she was still angry. As a result, I was grounded. But that was nothing compared to what happened later that night. Our house was old, with windows that could be easily jimmied open from the outside, even when locked. Max knew this because I'd used it to sneak out before. My mom's room, where she and my 2-year-old brother slept, was right across the hall from mine, facing the backyard. My room faced the street. That night I woke up around 2 in the morning because I was cold. When I put on my glasses, I realized why. My window was open. Panic shot through me as I scanned the room. My bedroom door was also open. As I stood up, I heard the quiet sound of my mom's door closing. I rushed across the hall as quietly as I could, and just as I reached her door, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a metallic click, like a gun being cocked. I threw open the door. The lights were on, and there was Max, crouched in the corner of the room, a cleaver in his hand. My brother was still sound asleep in his crib. My mom, however, was sitting up in bed, glasses on, calmly reading a Harry Potter book with a 10mm pistol pointed directly at Max, who was shaking and sobbing. She told him to shut up before he woke the baby, and then instructed me to call the police while she kept an eye on him. The cops arrived, and Max was taken into custody. My mom decided not to press charges because we couldn't afford the legal fees. Instead, she made a deal with Max's parents to send him to live with his dad in Arizona. After that, I didn't see much of him, except for the occasional Snapchat he'd send my friends, still begging to talk about me. But by then, I was done with him and his obsession. I had a relationship back in college with a guy who seemed normal at first. Things were fine until he suddenly became obsessed with religion. His behavior took a dark turn, and he started claiming that demons were talking to him. He tried to buy weapons through some sketchy people we knew and began fantasizing about hurting others. As if that wasn't bad enough, he grew increasingly controlling and abusive, both mentally and physically. It got to the point where he almost killed me more than once. I knew I had to get out, so I left him. For a while, he harassed me with threats and bizarre behavior, but then he seemed to disappear from my life. I thought I was free of him. One night, after a late meeting, I was heading back to my dorm. I decided to skip going straight back and instead took a detour to the student union to grab some ice cream. It was just down the street, and I figured it would be a nice way to wind down. As I walked past my dorm, I noticed something that put me on edge. I heard footsteps behind me, so I glanced back. I caught a glimpse of someone in a white shirt quickly ducking behind a large signboard. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The sound of rustling made me turn again. This time I saw a figure, roughly his size, partially hidden behind a tree. The streetlights weren't bright enough to see clearly, but it really looked like him. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew it was him. I started walking faster, trying not to make it obvious that I was scared. Every now and then, I'd hear footsteps or breathing behind me. I didn't dare stop or turn around again. He was the type who'd shoot me if given the chance, and I wasn't about to give him one. I reached the student union and went inside, trying to steady my nerves by buying some ice cream. I sat in the brightly lit store, not wanting to leave. The thought of stepping back into the darkness where he might be lurking was terrifying. I was still trying to figure out what to do when my phone buzzed. The message I received made my blood run cold. It was from a couple of friends, a sweet pair who had been walking behind me earlier. Their text was short but alarming. "Your ex is walking around the street." Before I could reply, they called me. They sounded scared, which only made me more anxious. They had seen him coming from the direction of the union, and they were sure he had a gun. They asked if I was with him, and I quickly assured them that I wasn't. I told them I was at the union, too afraid to head back to my dorm alone. They didn't hesitate to tell me to stay put and wait for them. They were on their way. A few minutes later, they rushed into the union, out of breath and wide-eyed. Seeing them so frightened unsettled me even more. The boyfriend, who was a black belt in karate and usually the calmest person I knew, looked on edge. He kept scanning the room like he expected my ex to jump out at any moment. They told me we were heading back to my dorm together and they were going to call the police. They positioned themselves on either side of me, with the boyfriend in front, leading the way. He kept shouting into the darkness, warning my ex to stay away. When we reached my dorm, they followed me inside and we quickly went up to my room. My roommates were there and they immediately called the police. We watched the street from our windows, hoping he wouldn't show up, but there he was. He was hiding among the trees near the dorm, just standing there looking up. The streetlight glinted off something shiny in his hand, and I realized he had a gun, a .22. He tugged at it, scanning the dorm, and then our eyes met. The look in his eyes sent a chill through me. It was a mix of rage and determination, and I knew without a doubt that he intended to kill me. But something about the situation made him hesitate, and after a tense moment, he turned and ran off into the trees. We called the police again, and within minutes, sirens filled the air. Officers arrived with their guns drawn, searching the area. They found him a few hours later, still clutching the .22. He confessed everything, saying he had planned to kill me. He claimed that because I had broken up with him, I was given over to Satan, and he needed to ensure I died and went to hell. He didn't want to shoot me with my friends around because, in his twisted mind, it would have complicated his mission. He was arrested and eventually sent to a mental hospital. I moved out of that dorm as soon as I could. The thought that he might escape and come after me again was too much to bear. My roommates moved out shortly after, with some police officers keeping an eye on them until they could leave. That experience left a deep scar on me. For years, I was constantly paranoid, always looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the fear that he might come back. Even now, though I can go about my life without fear most days, I still have nightmares. I see him in my dreams, staring at me from the trees, gun in hand, rage burning in his eyes. When I was 18, I got my first job at a small Italian food market. It was a new experience for me, and I was just starting to navigate the world of work and relationships. I was at that age where I thought I knew it all, but was really just learning the ropes. I worked in the prepared food section, right next to where the restaurant's line cooks operated. One of those cooks, a man named Tom, was 29 at the time. Looking back, the age gap seems alarming, but at the time I didn't see it that way. I was naive and didn't realize there was anything off about dating someone that much older. My co-workers had their suspicions. They even hinted that Tom had a questionable past, but I was young and dismissive of their warnings. Tom seemed kind and respectful at first, so I overlooked the rumors. Our relationship started innocently enough. Tom didn't have any social media, which he attributed to his age. I believed him. Today, I'd be more cautious. Googling someone's name and checking their online presence would be second nature. But back then, I didn't think to do that. It was only after a few dates and some minor intimacy that my parents found out about us. They were deeply concerned and almost took legal action against Tom. Out of respect for my parents' wishes, I ended things on relatively good terms, and Tom continued working as the sous chef. A month later, out of curiosity and with nothing else to do, I decided to Google Tom's full name. What I found was shocking. The search results were filled with disturbing headlines. Man charged with indecent exposure. Man found with inappropriate prop. Underage victims. It turned out, Tom had been driving around college campuses, pulling up to women and making lewd gestures with an inappropriate prop. His victims included women of all ages, many from all-girls universities, and some were underage. I was stunned. I dropped my phone when I saw his mugshot. I remembered an incident where Tom had gotten unusually angry when I tried to get into his car without him knowing. I had a chilling thought that the inappropriate prop might have been stashed somewhere in the car. I didn't report Tom myself, but someone else did, and he was soon fired from the market. I had already moved on to a new job by then, and I didn't return to the old place until I knew Tom was gone. Even now, the whole experience haunts me. I keep thinking about how close I came to being involved with someone who was so deeply disturbed. It's a stark reminder of how important it is to be cautious and informed. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Socializing in person was a struggle for me, so I turned to the internet for comfort. That's where I discovered type-based roleplay, and it quickly became my escape. My initial interest was Dragon Age, and I joined a roleplay group on DeviantArt called TMM. I spent countless hours in their chat, which unfortunately led to my grades slipping. But then I stumbled into the world of slender blogging, a niche form of roleplay involving Slender Man, and that's where I met Michael. I created a Slender blog, where I played a character similar to myself. Michael's character was a proxy, a servant of Slender Man, and he was one of the elite ones. We started chatting through emails, always staying in character. After about a year and a half of role-playing, I broke character to a mutual friend. The friend told Michael that I was just a regular person, which excited him. He messaged me, thrilled that I wasn't crazy, and we became close friends. We referred to that moment as the highlight of our role-playing experience. We began talking almost daily. Despite living 2 hours apart, he made an effort to sync his schedule with mine, even though I was a 15-year-old high school student with an early morning routine. His age, almost 20, didn't bother me given my maturity. Summer break made it easier for us to talk all the time. One night he convinced me to video chat for the first time. I was thrilled to finally see his face, and we talked all night until my dad confiscated my computer at 4 a.m. I gave Michael my phone number, and our connection deepened. During a visit to a friend's house, I told Michael I didn't think he could surprise me. He responded by asking me out. My friend helped me consider the situation carefully. Michael had always been respectful, so I accepted his offer after some thought. He was relieved and sent me many messages worrying that I might have been upset. I apologized for making him wait. The initial months were wonderful. We talked every night, even falling asleep on the phone. However, when school resumed, the dynamic shifted. I was used to spending almost all my free time with Michael, and balancing school and our relationship proved challenging. I didn't realize at the time how unhealthy it was to spend nearly 18 hours a day in contact with someone. Our first argument arose over texting. Mikhail wanted me to text him whenever I wasn't on a call, but texting during class was prohibited. We agreed on a compromise. I would text between classes and call during lunch. My limited social life meant that this arrangement didn't affect me much. The situation became strained when I reconnected with an old friend from middle school, who happened to be male. Michael reacted strongly, expressing jealousy and fear. He revealed that his ex had cheated on him, and he couldn't trust other guys around me. His reaction was intense, even tearful, and I was hurt, but agreed to avoid my male friends to keep the peace. As schoolwork increased, it became harder to manage my time. Michael accused me of not loving him enough and demanded more attention. He gave me an ultimatum: text him during class or call him right after school. I chose the latter, which left me with minimal family time and increased stress. Michael became increasingly controlling, insisting on knowing my exact schedule and reacting violently to any deviations. He even fabricated stories about my friends being evil entities. Michael's mental state was fragile. He spoke of a second personality named Strider, who he claimed was the source of his outbursts. He texted me in italics as Strider, blaming this persona for his cruel behavior. I empathized, as my own mental health struggles were at their peak, and my therapist had hinted at more severe conditions. For the next year and a half, Michael manipulated me, pushing me away from my family and friends. He convinced me that my teachers were part of a conspiracy and coerced me into inappropriate behavior. His abusive behavior was punctuated by periods of calm, only to spiral into new arguments. He even persuaded me to report my family to Child Protective Services for abuse. My family wasn't perfect. My father had a drinking problem and was often aggressive, while my mother was passive. Despite the tensions, my family provided for me and my sisters, and we lacked for nothing materially. My decision to call CPS was misguided and would have harmed my younger sisters. When my parents discovered the CPS call, I panicked and fled to a friend's house. Michael wanted me to stay there until a friend of his from Austin could pick me up. Seeing messages from my family and knowing I had frightened my sisters and triggered a police response, I decided to return home. I avoided letting my dad pick me up from my friend's house to prevent any threats against her family. I faced 6 months of juvenile probation, counseling, and my family endured another CPS inquiry due to my runaway. By the end, Michael and I were breaking up and reconciling frequently. He would send distressing photos of injuries, threatening self-harm to manipulate me. I hated him by then, but still cared enough to fear for his well-being. Our final breakup occurred when he found out I'd been talking to a male friend he despised. It took him 2 months to realize I wasn't coming back, but he continued to contact me using various numbers and email accounts. Eventually, he vanished and I began to rebuild my life. About a year ago, he reached out again, claiming he was married. I doubted his story, especially when he struggled to provide details. After confronting him, he became defensive. I blocked him once more, relieved that he was no longer a threat. Years ago, I found myself dating a man who seemed perfect at first. He was charming, considerate, and showed a side of himself that felt warm and genuine. We hit it off quickly, and within a month we were exclusive. It felt right, but I now realize it wasn't enough time to really get to know someone. We saw each other every day and spent most of our time at his place. I didn't mind much at first since I'm more of an introvert, but after a couple of months I started to wonder why we weren't going out more. Why were we just staying in? His answers were vague and evasive, and it was clear he was avoiding the question. This sparked my curiosity, and what followed was a series of unsettling discoveries. I'm not one to pry, but I felt I had the right to understand why we were isolating ourselves. When my questions seemed to push him away, I felt a growing sense of unease. One night while he was asleep, I couldn't shake off my suspicions. I went through his phone, and what I found was beyond shocking. I discovered clear evidence that I was the side person in his life. It made sense now why we never went out. The other woman was completely unaware of my existence. I couldn't stay beside him after that. It was around 2 a.m. when I quietly gathered my things and left for home. The next day, he seemed to realize what had happened, but he didn't reach out. The silence was unnerving. Later that evening, he called me. I confronted him with the evidence I had taken, knowing he might try to deny or twist the truth. His reaction was typical of someone trying to deflect blame. He accused me of invading his privacy and completely ignored his own wrongdoing. It was frustrating and infuriating. He seemed to be more concerned about me contacting the other woman than addressing his deceit. I didn't plan to tell her, as she seemed sheltered and unaware. I feared his retaliation against both of us. I still regret not reaching out to her, but at the time my primary concern was my own safety. Then things took a disturbing turn. His paranoia reached new heights, and he began sending me threatening messages, claiming he had compromising photos of me and would release them if I contacted his girlfriend. I was appalled by his delusion. Despite my attempts to reason with him, including having my mother speak to him, he persisted in his threats. The situation escalated further when he sent me multiple messages filled with intimate and compromising photos and videos of me that I had never seen before. He had installed hidden cameras in his room and was now using those images to threaten and blackmail me. This wasn't just empty threats. He had already uploaded some of the material online. I rushed to the police, who acted quickly to remove the content. However, once something is online, it's hard to fully erase it. The experience changed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found it difficult to trust people, form new relationships, or even engage in intimate situations. My outlook on relationships became guarded and cynical. The police were supportive and managed to secure a protection order. He violated it soon after, calling and begging for forgiveness. His pleas, including having his mother call me, were pathetic and only led to more police involvement. The case went to court and I won. It wasn't the outcome I had hoped for, but he was placed on the sex offenders registry, which was a significant consequence. The experience left deep scars, affecting how I view trust and relationships. To anyone who's faced a similar situation, I sympathize deeply with your pain. Be cautious around people you think you trust. It's a harsh lesson, but it's an important one. I was a very naive teenager, thinking I knew everything about love and relationships. Looking back, I can hardly believe how much I allowed myself to endure. My ex, though never physically abusive, controlled me in every other way possible. He manipulated me, gaslighted me, and played cruel mental games that I didn't even realize were happening at the time. For 8 long years, I believed every lie, accepted every hurtful action, and allowed him to twist my reality to fit his own dark desires. I convinced myself that he loved me and that these actions were just part of being in a relationship. I even forgave him for the things that should have sent me running. But I was young, and I thought that wearing his promise ring meant I was his, that somehow this behavior would fade with time. I finally found the strength to leave him when I was 17. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next 6 years, he never really let me go. He didn't come after me physically. No, he was far too clever for that. Instead, he found ways to linger in my life, reminding me constantly that he was still there, watching, waiting. Every month, like clockwork, I would receive the same message: I'm still here. Whether it was on Facebook, through my phone, or via email, it always arrived on the same day, at the same time, without fail. He'd even call me from anonymous numbers just to breathe into the phone, saying nothing but sending a clear message. I wasn't free of him. It drove me crazy, but there was nothing I could do. He wasn't technically breaking any laws, so there was no use going to the authorities. Even if I had, who would have taken me seriously? So I did the only thing I could. I blocked his accounts, ignored his calls, and tried to move on with my life. And for a long time, that was the routine. Every month, I braced myself for that message, steeling myself against the inevitable chill it sent down my spine. But then, 2 months ago, something changed. The messages stopped. At first, I didn't notice. I was busy with work, with life, and with something new and wonderful. I had just gotten engaged. I posted about it on Facebook, sharing my happiness with the world. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I realized I hadn't heard from him since that post. The day passed when I usually received his message, and there was nothing. Another month went by and still nothing. It was almost too good to be true, and that's when I started to worry. I knew him too well to believe that he had simply given up. No, there had to be something more. And then it hit me. He must have seen my engagement announcement. In his twisted mind, I was no longer his property. I belonged to someone else now, and that apparently was enough for him to stop his torment. But the unease didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, he hadn't bothered me in 2 months. Maybe he really had moved on. Maybe he had found someone else to manipulate, someone else to control. But deep down, I knew better. He was never one to let go of something he thought was his, not without a fight. And even though I hadn't heard from him, I couldn't help but feel like he was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. The days passed slowly, each one filled with a creeping sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something I couldn't see coming. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking that the doors were locked at night. My fiancé noticed my unease, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the whole truth. How could I explain that? Even after all these years, I still felt like my ex had some hold over me, that even though I had moved on, he hadn't? One evening, about a month after the messages stopped, I was walking home from work. It was a typical day. The streets were busy with people rushing home, the sun setting behind the buildings. But as I turned the corner onto my street, I felt it, that familiar chill running down my spine. I slowed my pace, glancing around, trying to see if anyone was following me. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual bustle of city life. But the feeling didn't go away. When I reached my apartment, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding. I stood there for a moment, just listening, trying to catch any sound that might be out of place. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I walked through the apartment, checking every room, every closet, every window. Nothing was amiss, but the sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. My mind raced with thoughts of what he could be planning, how he could be watching me without my knowing. The rational part of me knew it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the fear was real, and it kept me on edge. The next morning I woke up to a bright, sunny day, and for a moment, I felt foolish for letting my fears get the best of me. But as I got ready for work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My phone, which I had left charging on the nightstand, was lying on the floor, the screen cracked. I hadn't touched it since the night before, and I was sure it had been on the nightstand when I went to bed. But there it was, on the floor, as if someone had picked it up and dropped it. I tried to brush it off as an accident, maybe I had knocked it over in my sleep. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. It didn't make sense. And then, as I picked up the phone, I saw it, a new message notification. My heart stopped. I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the screen to read it. I'm still here. The message was simple, the same as always, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just a reminder that he hadn't forgotten me. It was a warning. He was letting me know that he was close, closer than ever before, and I had no idea what he was planning next. I deleted the message, but the fear remained. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I knew I had to do something, but what? He had never physically hurt me, never crossed that line, but now, with the messages starting again, I couldn't be sure that he wouldn't. Days turned into weeks, and still, I lived in a state of constant vigilance. I didn't tell anyone about the message or the broken phone. I didn't want to worry them, didn't want to seem paranoid. But I was. Every noise in the night, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye, felt like a threat. I knew he was out there, watching, waiting. Then, one night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, stepping inside cautiously. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street outside. I reached for the light switch, but something stopped me. A feeling deep in my gut told me not to turn on the light. I stood there in the darkness listening, and that's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the bedroom. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but I was frozen in place. The sound grew louder, closer. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob, ready to bolt. But then the rustling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Slowly, I backed out of the apartment, pulling the door shut behind me. I ran down the stairs out into the street, not stopping until I was several blocks away, surrounded by people. It was only then that I realized I was still clutching my phone, my knuckles white with fear. I looked down at it, half expecting to see another message. But the screen was blank. I knew then that I couldn't go back to that apartment, not until I knew for sure that he was gone, that he wasn't lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stayed with a friend that night, not telling them the real reason I was there. The next day I went to the police, but as expected, there was little they could do. He hadn't broken any laws, and without any solid evidence, they couldn't even question him. But I knew he was out there, and I knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. So now I wait. I don't know what he's planning or when he'll strike, but I'm ready for him. This time I won't be the naive girl he once controlled. This time I'll be the one who's prepared, because I know one thing for sure: he's still here, and so am I.